Welcome to this presentation on independent writing, where we look at teaching independent writing in the classroom within the broader context of teaching writing more generally, given support students may need along the way. What are we going to look at? We're going to think about what do we actually mean by independent writing. We're also going to look at the relationship between independent writing and more supported writing that hopefully leads to independence. And then we're going to look at how we might encourage independent writing in classrooms, setting up certain opportunities for writing and so on. So what do we mean by independent writing? It sounds straightforward, doesn't it? But I think often it's interpreted as being individual writing. Now, it certainly can be. However, independent writing means independent of the teacher. Now, that could mean students writing individually, absolutely, but it could also mean students writing in small groups, as you can see in these images here. They're writing together, which often writers do in the real world, and they're supporting each other, but it's not the support of the teacher. Hopefully the support of the teacher has already occurred in the lead up to independent writing. So I think it's important to remember it could be pairs, small groups, or individually, and it's really about students getting the chance without the teacher to apply what they've learnt about writing up until that particular point. Something else to consider are the stages of the writing process: planning, drafting, editing and reviewing, and publishing. When we say writing, I think we often think about drafting a text, that initial point of writing down a text. But we could also be planning independently. And it may be that within the classrooms, we have a range of different graphic organisers on hand, be them paper copies or things like mini whiteboards or digital tools to actually assist in planning. And again, that planning process would have already been modelled and done jointly with students before moving to independence. Same with drafting. Students might be drafting, absolutely, after their planning, if their text requires a lot of planning as well. And we can also look at editing and reviewing, that we want our students to do that independently of the teacher, but also having had it modelled and so on prior. So students actually have a good understanding, a deep understanding of how to do such things in the process of writing. And equally for publishing, have our students been supported already in how to publish, what choices to make, what tools to use, and so on, and then can do so effectively independently. Now, all of this, again, if you think about independent might be in small groups, a lot of talk and collaboration and so on can be provided by students with each other, but also a necessity in constructing a text ultimately. We can also think about what is the relationship between independent and supported writing. Now, you could probably hear that in what I've been saying so far, that when we're expecting students to be independent of the teacher, there has been probably quite significant teaching leading up to that, and quite explicit teaching leading up to that point, so that when students are actually expected to write independently, it's a positive experience. They feel equipped, they've had the right scaffolding or support, and it's time to let them go and have a go on their own without the teacher. So that brings me to the teaching and learning cycle, where we're looking in this presentation, obviously, at independent writing, but it's not something that's done in isolation. It's part of a broader learning sequence, part of the broader thinking a teacher does when designing overall teaching and learning sequences or units of work and so on. So the teaching and learning cycle has been in existence for quite a long time now. It's not new. And this particular version here, there are plenty of versions floating around, is a simplified version. And we're going to take a quick look at it now. So when looking at independent writing, you can see that that's right up the top there in that sort of yellowish band. Independent construction or independent writing doesn't just have to be writing in terms of written text. It might involve multimodal visual text as well. Prior to moving into independence, hopefully we've had some joint construction maybe once, but maybe multiple times, depending on the needs of the students. And then if we continue to work backwards, modeling and deconstruction, where students have seen what that text or that target genre or purpose for writing actually looks like. They're not going into independence blindly. They've had some teaching already. Now, that might be teaching that's happened quite so much at the similar time, or it might be something that they've actually grown to develop over a number of years. And so much explicit teaching may not be necessary because they have the skills to be independent. So that's something to think about over time. But we also always want to be pushing our students to do something new, not redoing what they've done for years at school. So again, lots to think about in the planning process. You'll also see field building is critical here. That's ongoing, and it's something we need to be doing all the time. So if you think about maybe a text has been written jointly, that might be on particular information. But when students move to independence, then the information might be different. So they might be required to do further research. Now, again, that needs to be modelled and supported before they get to that point. And we can see how the writing and reading suddenly start relating to each other, as does speaking and listening, but in particular, talk about language or taking on language about language or meta language, where it's initially in the modelling for sure and moving into joint construction, teach talk about language. But when we move into independence, when students reflect on their own text, where they're working in small groups, when they're providing feedback to each other, they're actually using that meta language as well for perhaps editing and reviewing purposes, or just giving general feedback to peers and so on. So this is a really helpful model for designing learning, for teaching writing in particular, but showing, probably of most importance, that independent writing isn't something to occur in isolation. It occurs as a build-up of skills, knowledge, and understanding over the short term, but also the long term for students. Some things to think about when supporting students or moving students is probably a better word towards independence. Is it clear to them the relationship to curriculum content? Are they writing about what they've been learning about in science or history or English, for example? Do they clearly know what their purpose is or the genre for writing? It's very different to explain something as opposed to instructing someone on how to do it. Can they recount in history but tell a story or narrate in English? Are they clear on the differences? And that comes back to the context all the time as well. I've already mentioned the topic and the student knowledge. Do they have the knowledge at the point of independence to be able to write the text, or is more research required? Or should the teacher be giving the information to the students already researched for students to take that and then focus on their writing? Again, this will depend on the curriculum content and context. What's the relationship between the reader and writer? As a student, am I writing to engage a friend, or am I writing to someone in a position of power and I want them to take on some of my ideas and thinking? My choices at the point of writing will be very different depending on those two audiences. Also, how will I organise my text? Is it just written text, or is it a combination of maybe words, images, audio, voiceover? Who knows? It might be multimodal as well. So we're in this presentation talking about writing in particular, but writing is often an aspect of more multimodal presentations. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then also, what will the language features be and the meta language be that's already been made explicit? Do students know this? Can they use this as they think about maybe they're writing at the point of planning, but also when reflecting on their texts also? And then just the last point there is, do we have a shift? When we go to independent writing, are we writing on a slightly different topic from the same curriculum area, albeit, than we did in joint construction and when a text was modelled? If not, we're actually not challenging or engaging our students. If they're producing exactly the same text that's been modelled and jointly constructed, we're not really pushing them beyond where they may currently be. And it's certainly not very interesting writing the same text over and over again. So again, you can see the importance of research, having the topic knowledge, and so on. And that keeps going back to the area of the curriculum and that actual curriculum unit that we're writing within. Let's have a look at an example based on what I was just mentioning. So this might be a science unit, okay, where the purpose for writing is to write an information report in which the purpose will be to classify and describe generally. That tends to be what reports do. The subject matter might be something like it's a science topic on mini beasts. And maybe the independent piece of writing we're going to get students to write is on wasps. Maybe we've been observing wasps. We've been researching wasps. There's a big chart in the classroom hanging up with all sorts of information on wasps and other mini beasts. So it's easy to draw upon. So that topic knowledge already exists because of the science unit. How are we going to write? We want to sound like we know our stuff. We're an expert and we're writing to people who don't know very much about wasps. Maybe we put in things that most people don't know. Maybe wasps have a bit of a reputation and we want to kind of counteract that and so on. So opportunity for a lot of talk about audience. And then the mode, written and visual, I have here because I would be suspecting that a report like this probably has some kind of accompanying images, particularly in terms of the appearance and the parts, a labeled diagram perhaps. So we get that multimodal aspect. Now that might be the final task for the sequence of lessons, independent construction. There's a lot of knowledge about the text, but also the topic and also the audience and mode, etc., that students need to complete this task independently, but effectively. So if we go backwards in terms of the teaching and learning cycle, here we have modelling and deconstruction. So way back before students became independent, they would have had a text modelled, same genre, same topic in terms of science, etc., same audience, same organisation, but we would have had a slightly different subject matter, butterflies. So that information would have been up on the wall. That information would have been in books. It would have been visible. There would have been lots of talking and listening games on features of these mini beasts and so on. So modelled with a different topic. If we then moved on to a joint construction, maybe we choose another mini beast, spiders or bees or whatever. So we want to shift that field from that high support when we're modelling with students to ultimately when we get to the independent with joint along the way, where we shift that topic, but we're still working in the same area and we're still, most importantly, writing for the same purpose using the same genre. So we're gradually letting go of that support. So from high support, in this case, back to the lower support where students are writing about their own mini beast. Maybe they choose their own, or maybe we give them one like wasps, for instance. So the other thing is, at the point of independence, and we've talked about a few things that students and the teacher obviously will need to consider, but we can give them explicit criteria for their writing. Now, the important thing is this criteria is familiar to students. It's nothing they haven't heard of. It's being unpacked in model texts. It's also being discussed, teachers and students discussing these choices when they've done joint constructions. And students now know what it means to actually write an effective text. So if we stick with the science context, and I'm putting who I want my writers to be up front, I can write like a scientist, because it's very different writing like a scientist as compared to a reporter or an historian or a health expert and so on. How will I know that I can do this? I'll be classifying and describing mini beasts in bundles of information. Now, the reason I've written this like this is because probably how I may have talked about it during the modelling and joint construction. And note that we're making the purpose clear up front, classifying, describing. We're also linking to perhaps how the text might be structured, where we tend to classify and then describe in bundles or paragraphs of information. I also have highlight the topic for the reader with paragraph and sentence starters. So because we've looked at typical features of these reports, we do tend to know that the openers or beginnings, the bit or bits before the verb in the text, the paragraph, sentence, and even clauses, tends to focus on the topic. So wasps, for instance, okay, or many species of wasp, or the female wasp. But there'll be slight variations, but that focus on wasp will always be up front. In other texts for different purposes, that might not be the case. We might have a variety of openers because the purpose of the text differs. And finally, in our modelling and joint construction and a whole lot of speaking, listening tasks and so on, we would have also been focusing on extending noun groups to build description. Now, that might have included having adjectives in front of the noun, but possibly even adjectival phrases after the noun, or even adjectival clauses to further extend the noun group. Now, as I said, this is all clear to students by the time they become independent or are in the role of independent writing because of that broader teaching and learning cycle. Let's take a slightly different context. Maybe I'm going to be a great novelist. I'm going to publish my first novel, for instance. And again, none of this criteria should be unfamiliar to students because it's being modelled and discussed jointly. I'm going to focus just on, maybe I'm just going to really craft a really strong paragraph, developing relationships between characters. So I want to show what my characters, how they feel about each other, how they interact, and so on. How will I do this? Also describe their actions, but also their sensing through verb choice. So I might have characters that do certain things. Maybe they, I don't know, quiver, turn away, hide. That tells me something about them. Maybe there's another character who dominates, who instigates, etc. And then I might also have a sprinkling of sensory verbs in terms of getting inside the character's head. What do they think? What do they feel? Maybe one loves, adores. Maybe the other one hates and despises something. Maybe they are thinkers in the text. Maybe one imagines, wonders, considers. Maybe the other one doesn't have any sensing verbs at all. They just act. All these choices are going to show how these characters interact with each other. Now, again, it wouldn't be fair to bring this in when students are writing independently. This has to be part of the prior learning. And we also have other tools here, constructing the dialogue with these characters in terms of characters making different choices in terms of the function of their clauses. Maybe one character is very inquisitive, the one that wonders and thinks and considers, and they ask lots of questions. So in the dialogue, that might be their role. Maybe the other character is quite dominant and bossy, maybe even aggressive. Maybe they make lots of commands. They tell the other characters what to do. So again, we're using these language features or grammatical tools, if you like, to construct meaning. But we need this to be understood at the point of independence, not introduce it at the point of independence. It's about classroom talk that's led up to this. So let's have a think. Where to? How can we encourage independent writing in the classrooms? How do we make kids love writing? I think we need to show that we love writing when we're modelling and jointly constructing. Model ourselves as writers and thinkers and reflectors so that that enthusiasm and thoughtfulness is carried on by the students, with the students initially and by the students. Get excited about what's written. Be puzzled, be thoughtful. Question your own writing, model that critical thinking about writing as well. So that it's supported and nothing out of context or in isolation to other teaching and learning included in the classroom. Coming back to that point about linking to curriculum topics, all topics of interest. If you have students in your classroom who are absolute experts on a particular topic, that's fine. Let them write about that. They might go and write reports independently on something else. After they've done their WASP report, they might go and write on a particular type of car that they're into when they're writing independently. It could be extended further if they're interested and have the field or the topic knowledge. Draw upon those existing skills, knowledge, and understanding, which I've just talked about in terms of criteria, but that criteria is developed way before they get to independence. It could even be developed jointly as well. And probably most importantly, create authentic contexts and purposes and audiences for writing. Ideally, students get to share their writing with an audience, but even if they don't, even if it's a hypothetical audience, it's really important because it will give students something to hold on to. It's very hard to write or speak, for that matter, if you don't know who you're aiming it at. So that should always be very, very explicit throughout the whole teaching program. Now, I think if we've got a handle on all of these at the point of planning, and we're modeling the love of writing, we're modeling the process of writing, and our struggles with it and so on, and our thinking about it, you're going to have engaged writers. And it's a key part of what goes on probably every day in the classroom. This question comes up a lot though. But what about writing for pleasure, creativity, fluency, and in recent years, I've heard the word stamina. I think these things are all addressed in what we've talked about so far. Pleasure, if you're well supported, if you have the tools, if you have the background knowledge, if you have the openness in the classroom to transfer that to some background knowledge that you are an expert in or absolutely love or have high interest for, there's going to be pleasure. Creativity, we need to show that when we're looking at different models. We certainly will talk about typical features in text, but also point out the atypical. And the creativity is going to come when that writing context is really clear. Who am I writing for? What am I trying to do? What are some tools I have in my little toolkit that will let me do that? And maybe I'll do it in a slightly different way to someone else, but I will achieve my purpose and I'll be able to justify how I'm going about doing that. The more tools coming from the more explicit teaching, the development of a shared meta language, the more I have to actually use to be creative. And in terms of fluency and stamina, I think sometimes this is because students may not get the opportunity to write independently enough. So perhaps running alongside the writing program are frequent opportunities throughout the day, across the week, for students to be writing independently frequently. But again, we often hear terms like free writing. That's okay. That's not going to work for all students. We can give choice, but we also need to give, again, that context and topic and so on, so that students who aren't feeling as comfortable at the point of independence actually have some support they can draw upon. So upping those possibilities. If you have things like literacy sessions and so on, maybe one of those tasks every day is to write, but writing in a context that's familiar or exciting or engaging, interesting, and so on. So I don't think these things are separate from each other. High support, high challenge results in these things, and hopefully students loving writing. So have a quick look here. I'll just talk through this very briefly. This comes from a Peter publication called Tell Me Your Story. And it was looked at over a number of terms with a particular school in terms of planning writing. And their kind of issue was they seemed to have a writing focus for a few weeks or even a term. And then the next term would come around and that focus would kind of completely change. And whatever happened prior seemed to have been forgotten. And it was really a missed opportunity, because what students got their teeth into and enjoyed and mastered in one sequence of learning was never really kind of come back to. So if you have a look here, you'll see there's actually two sections, and I'll just hide myself. We've got high support on the one side and low support on the other side. Now, initially students were involved in an English unit where they were writing poetry. they had a choice, poetry or prose actually, but it was about provoking emotion in a reader and engaging them on the topic of bushfires. So reading program related to this and so on. Their audience was other students in the community, obviously people they knew, but also thinking about how to actually engage people who were perhaps more distant, may not have even had their own same experiences. And it was writing. So if you follow the arrow going from that, the second term, the English focus continued, but this is the low support. This was independent writing. This was independent of the teacher. So it might have been in those small groups during literacy time where students were still writing poetry, but they moved into that broader topic of not just bushfires, but natural disasters. And this is because they had that information from the science unit in the previous term. So slight tweak, but what was highly supported in term one, in term two, less support because the students had a grasp of the poetry and natural disasters more generally, and they were doing it independently. If you have a look at the second term, we moved into English and science, and the focus was on informing and describing and explaining through news reports and a little bit of written and oral, sort of written news reports, but also presenting as in a news bulletin and so on. Now, the topic, again, a little bit different, not from an English perspective, but a science perspective, was on earthquakes. It's still related to that natural disasters topic overall. And it was aimed at writing these news reports for, if you think about news, the general public, okay? So not so much your friends and who you know, but a broader, more distant audience. And you can see they're written and oral. Now, what we have then is that later in the year, if you follow the arrow down, we take what was done there in terms of news reports, so this is on the very bottom row, and move into English and history, but the topic's not earthquakes anymore, it's now Ned Kelly, because we're looking at history. So we're just tweaking some of these areas to move from that high support and then tweak it somewhat so that students continue their focus, but with low support, so independent writing. And the final one in terms of high support, again, English and history, and this is where the Ned Kelly reference comes from. But initially they were writing comics, okay, to inform and entertain, and also convey a point of view about Ned Kelly in particular. So again, specific distant audience, and we're dealing with history here, and so interpretation of history, and that's where the field for that bottom focus actually came from in terms of Ned Kelly. So when they'd moved back into independently writing newspapers on Ned Kelly, they already had the topic or the field knowledge. So this diagram could have multiple rows underneath if you plan across a term or a year, depending on your students, to think about how to make slight tweaks where students, and they were heavily engaged because they knew their stuff. By the time they were writing independently, so on that low support side, they understood the purpose for writing or the genre. They'd done lots of talk about audience, and in particular, they had the field knowledge because it was developed in the weeks or terms before, be it in history or science or English. So just a way to think about planning for independent writing that is related to that broader writing program and can be ongoing and effective because students have the background and therefore are going to be more successful. So a couple of other a little bit like we had there, we had comics, we had poetry, we had news reports, etc. What are some other possible ideas for independent writing? And of course, this is going to be different based on the age of your students, what their needs are, and so on. So we could have an ongoing class newsletter, maybe in term one that's begun with high support, and then maybe it's carried independently throughout the rest of the year. You can imagine different roles students could have reporters, photographers, editors, etc. We could change those independent roles as the year progresses. Same with a class blog. Maybe that is something that's set up in term 2 and then independently continues across the year. So they're writing independently and there's a clear context and purpose and audience and so on. We might even, similar to what we had in our previous example, look at poetry, where we have a poetry corner or poetry place. And obviously there's a whole lot of poetry books within the classroom, but over time, after that high support around poetry has started in one cycle of teaching, it becomes independent and you end up with a, either personal or whole class poetry anthology that's being done independently. Maybe they're just novelists. Maybe you've got a class full of students who just love to write and create stories. Perfect. Let them do that. Let them do that. But also have throughout the year that high support that challenges them and takes them beyond where they currently are so that their independent writing shifts also. Similar thing, cartoonists or graphic novels, using those as models and then again, using different content across the curriculum to continue developing these independently. Letters of concern. So this is your more persuasive kind of text. Now, again, depending on what you're writing at the time or learning about at the time in different subject areas, maybe there's a perfect place for what may have been given high support at some stage in the year then becomes independent writing because the topics in the classroom lend themselves to that. We can also have texts that are, so maybe more scientific texts where students are having to research themselves on expert knowledge. Again, maybe it's on different, maybe you've got a group of kids who still want to do stuff on mini beasts. Let them continue, let them research it, let them keep writing. Bilingual books or bilingual texts, if you've got students in your classroom from different language backgrounds, perfect. Get them writing in their first language or maybe get them writing in both English and their first or second or third language for that matter, and sharing those across the classroom, across the school and so on. Diaries or journals, they're a bit of a classic, aren't they? Some students love writing these, some don't so much, but even a diary from an historical perspective for older students or a journal in terms of a science journal, observations they're making. Again, marrying these focus areas to different aspects of the curriculum, but ensuring students have had some support around them initially. Things like scrapbooks or lap books where you can sort of stick together manila folders and have all sorts of different pieces of writing included would be worth thinking about too, that students actually develop across the year to include all their independent writing and so on, or include planning or ideas, photographs that inspire them, artworks that inspire them, all sorts of things. And then finally, we've got editors and publishers where they actually take on the role of editing maybe, and maybe even publishing someone else's work. You could actually set up a whole publishing sort of, it's like a publishing business, isn't it really, in the classroom? But again, it has to be something that's done and introduced over time. So moving from high support before moving students into that more low support or independent writing. So it's really about a whole term, even whole year plan for writing and how that's going to evolve from high to low support and kind of spiraling in and out of that. So let's have a look. Some things we might want our students to think about, and we could make up different proformas or sheets or have these things on little strips of paper or paddle pot sticks so that we keep getting them to focus on these before they write or during the writing process when they're writing independently. What's my purpose for writing? Can they articulate that? And this is our assessment as well. We need to monitor that they're able to discuss these things. What will I write about? Will I need to research the topic, or do I already have the knowledge? Or maybe it's my own ideas or my own experience. Who am I writing for? Is it someone I know? Is it someone I will never meet? Is it someone who has equal or less than or more knowledge? Is it someone who wants something from me? Or is it someone who can give something to me? All of those things. And this talk should be something that's not unfamiliar at the point of independence. How will my writing be organised? Will it be in paragraphs? Will there be headings, subheadings? Will there be links? What will there be? Will I need images or other multimodal features? How will I plan for my writing? Do I have lots of things to draw on in terms of graphic organizers? Do I know how to brainstorm and categorize my ideas effectively? Have I got post-it notes on hand that will help me with my planning and so on? Will it be one piece of writing or multiple? So for some students, they might want to write their own novel. So maybe they keep writing independently their own chapters and building upon it. Maybe others write multiple different pieces of writing when they're independent as well. I think it's something that you can negotiate with individual students at the point of independence. Will I edit and review my writing? Sounds like, you'd probably say yes, but if I'm just writing for myself, like it's a personal reflection, I may not need to. But if I'm writing for a broader audience, I probably do. Will I need feedback from others? Will I ask the teacher for feedback? And that might be where teacher conferencing comes in as well at the point of independence, where the teacher is giving feedback through this process. But it might be that I have friends or there's other students in my classroom who can give me feedback. Maybe there's the appointed editor for the week who's going to give me feedback. And finally, will I publish my writing? And if so, how and where? Now, each of those questions is quite large, but if we keep our students thinking about those questions, we're dealing with writing authentically for a purpose, to get a job done, to achieve a goal. We're thinking about what we're writing about, who for, and how we'll put it together. And we're also being guided through the process. So really important questions that you could use or tweak for your own students. Number of ways that they could be presented to students. But again, these things would have been discussed earlier in the teaching sequence anyway. So just to finish off, a couple of places that you could go to after this video. I've put Tell Me Your Story up there because that's where that little planning model came from. And it's authentic. It was done with a particular school. And you can find a whole chapter on that and how that looks, that move from high support to low support, which is really what we're talking about in terms of thinking about independent writing. You'll also see Beverly Derivienko's Exploring How Texts Work and also Put It in Writing, which have several examples of using the teaching and learning cycle, obviously including independent writing, but thinking about different models and different ways that you could go about doing it. And sometimes it's really helpful to start your planning by looking at something that already exists. Very rarely do we use things as they are because our contexts are all different, but they can give some really great ideas for how to actually continue